The child prodigy named Alessandro Gervasi, Political Correctness, the Protection of Privacy and Galloping Senile Dementia on a Planetary Level, by Ciro Discepolo. I was truly surprised to see in every newspaper and on every TV broadcaster the photo of Alessandro Gervasi, the child prodigy who plays the piano as easily as any of us could be capable of riding an elevator. But where is the extraordinariness of the event? Well, obviously in the fact that no press organ, it is indeed about organs, has put the regulatory face-covering strips on the photos of the boy. Until the day before yesterday, this was also theoretically impossible, and on the subject several years ago I even published a book, Vietato severamente fotografare, strictly forbidden to photograph, Guida Editori, Naples, 2019, 184 pages. However, currently, as I have already had the opportunity to predict in writing, Pluto passing into Aquarius is overturning everything, even human stupidity. Read the preface of the same, and then I will offer some very brief final considerations. Preface. It was the autumn of 2016, and I had been living in Milan for a few months. I went to one of the most important and prestigious museum complexes in the city to admire and photograph some marvelous works by artists from many centuries ago. I noticed once again how everything in the Milanese city is well maintained and functions almost perfectly, starting with the press accreditation, which is possible to do on the spot in a few seconds, and which in most cases offers free admission. The lady in charge of the cash desk was about to issue me the entry ticket when she noticed my large professional Sony camera around my neck and said to me, "Do you know that you cannot take photographs?" "No." "Why?" "I can't tell you, but there is a sign." "Could I speak with a manager?" A few seconds passed, and a lady almost my age, but with a severe face and manner, asked me what the problem was. "Do you know that there is a law called the Franceschini Law, which establishes that it is possible to photograph in public museums throughout the national territory, provided that you do not use the flash or a tripod?" "Yes, I know it, but here the Franceschini Law does not apply." "And why? Are we in San Marino or the Vatican?" I will not report the continuation of this brief conversation, because it would only be detrimental to the beautiful structure I wish to visit, but I will only add that before leaving the building in protest, giving up the free ticket, I asked again, "And can I take photos with my cell phone?" "Yes, you can take photos with your cell phone. And what is the difference?" Silence. It should be noted that I had one of the latest Huawei models with 4 Leica cameras, with a 42-megapixel Sony sensor and very low noise, to be able to photograph almost in the dark and with very little photographic disturbance. As I said, I left in protest. Subsequently, when I had already published my first 3 out of 7 photojournalism books dedicated to Milan, I sent a copy to a politician who was and is involved in culture, asking him to dedicate a few minutes of his time so that I could explain some small absurdities to him within a city that is an excellence in so many aspects. The politician refused to receive me and replied that I could send an email to one of his collaborators. I replied that it was fine for me to speak with his collaborator and not directly with him who did not have time for me, but not through an email. Thus, many weeks after my request, I was received by a manager who welcomed me with great courtesy. I highlighted what had happened and told her that I had a fairly long list of other similar episodes. You know, the young doctor in charge of getting rid of me replied to me, Sometimes it's a problem with royalties. But do you understand that we are talking about Renaissance paintings? I'll stop here because my aim is not to criminalize a sector that also excels from various points of view. But you can understand that the title of this book of mine is extremely apt and reminds us of a mental perimeter, an optical frame too, that long characterized the youth of those millions of boys like me, born immediately after the Second World War. We went to the cinema. Television did not exist yet, and in the most daring scenes, the frame showed the bare shoulders and the attachment of the highest part of the breasts of stunning women who had just emerged from the sea or a bathtub, letting us imagine wonderful and strictly forbidden details produced by our imagination, and which censors of the type Prefect Gonella from Fellini's films La Voce della Luna, Italy, 1990, could not yet control in our minds. Am I exaggerating? Shall we ask authoritative art critics who could enlighten us on millennia of art history, where even Greek and Roman statues were made with male genitals the size of those of newborns, perhaps so as not to disturb the long lines of nuns who would visit the museums, but also the young girls of good society who did not yet know YouPorn to educate themselves on the matter. The fact remains that even today, if someone dares to repost on Facebook the photo of Gustave Courbet's famous painting L'Origine du Monde, The Origin of the World, with a fantastic, from a pictorial point of view, vagina in the foreground, they get many days of expulsion from said social network. My character radicalism of an absolutely secular orientation, before taking shape in what I believe is irreversible agnosticism, meant that already in middle school, when a coarse country priest entered, who used his trouser belt to teach us to reason well, the first phrase heard in class was, "Discepolo, get out." And I left, not without satisfaction. Then, for me, there were decades that seemed like centuries of fierce obscurantism, where everything was forbidden to me, even touching myself, because, as my mother said, Jesus would have cried. And I, who was fundamentally a good boy, avoided touching myself so as not to make him cry. Drugs, alcohol, sex were mysteries to me, until I was 18, when, with my identity card in hand, I went to a clandestine brothel in the Spanish quarters of Naples for the first time to have my baptism of sex. Then there has been a little wine over the course of life. Drugs never, because they never intrigued me. Over the years that followed, I understood that censorship, so inherent in the Catholic education that has formed us for at least the last 2,000 years, was not and is not specifically oriented towards sex, but we could say, out of ideal sympathy, follows in the footsteps of the non, thinking of the fireman of Fahrenheit 451, or of Big Brother of 1984 by George Orwell, censor to control, perhaps in deference to what is most ancestral and mythologemic in the human soul. Cumanna è meglio che fottere. Commanding is better than fucking. Then there is the other issue concerning the corporals. Here great men like Totò and Schiascia taught very well. Prince Antonio de Curtis, Focas Flavio Angelo Ducas, Comneno de Curtis di Bisanzio Gagliardi Antonio, Prince Count Palatine, Knight of the Holy Roman Empire, Imperial Highness, or more simply, Toto, maintained that in the world there are only two human species, men and corporals. We know the first quite well. The second are those people of the lowest cultural level who have been put in a uniform and who feel an almost sexual pleasure in prohibiting something to anyone. For the great author of Il Giorno della Civetta, the day of the owl, however, I have a certain practice of the world and what we call humanity, and fill our mouths saying humanity, a beautiful word full of wind. I divide into 5 categories: men, half men, little men, with all due respect, pigliaincolo, ass-takers, and quacquaraqua, quackers. Very few men, few half men. I would be content if humanity stopped at half men. And instead, no, it goes even further down to the little men, who are like children who think they are grown-ups, monkeys who make the same moves as grown-ups, and even further down, the pigliaincolo, who are becoming an army, and finally the quacquaraqua, who should live like ducks in puddles, because their life no longer has more meaning and expression than that of ducks. You, even if you nail me to these papers like a Christ, you are a man. Leonardo Sciascia, Il giorno della civetta, Turin, Einaudi, 1961. This is the passage in which the mafia boss Mariano expresses his respect for the protagonist of the novel, the Carabinieri Captain Bellodi. But if we wanted to write or rewrite a history of human censorship, we would have to work for many years, and therefore to stick strictly to the theme of this book, let us briefly remember again Andreotti's censorship of ladri di biciclette, bicycle thieves. It is better that wrong ideas about our country are not formed abroad through scenes that lead one to think of a nation on its knees, practically starving, and where the ancient saying homo homini lupus, man is wolf to man, man eats man, is a daily reality that even sees desperate people stealing a bicycle from other desperate people who, as a result, will not have a living. I quote from memory, author's note, "It is not appropriate." This is the phrase with which always, in Italy at least, every censorship operation has been justified. And here another personal and relevant amarcord of my youth is triggered. I was over 20 and was fulfilling my military obligations late at the car barracks in Bari, Carbonara to be precise. I lived with infinite sadness during that period, which, among other things, took away the salary of assistant researcher at the CNR, which I had received until a month before, throwing me back into the absolute darkness of personal poverty, and above all, kept me away from my girlfriend, who, however, did not suffer even a little from that distance, and was actually very happy about it. I spent my free hours in a small and filthy bar in the barracks, where I ate the only edible things, bondi, motta, snacks, and milk. The food from the mess was inedible. Then, as in an infernal circle, or as in the scene of the Fellini film, in which Marcello Mastroianni whips the women who passed by sitting at a tiny table, dirtier than the place where I was, among coffee stains and more, I continued to write long and uselessly romantic letters to my girlfriend. One day we were announced the visit of a very important general, commander of a large military area of southern Italy. We were all lined up at attention. The general said something rhetorical and then asked, "Are there any questions?" The invitation was repeated a couple of times, and I foolishly raised my hand. "Commander, could I know why the brand new premises already inaugurated and intended to host the soldiers during hours free from marches are always closed, and we are all forced to crowd into the few square meters of the tiny bar store?" The high-ranking soldier looked around, feigning incredulity, and the barracks commander hastened to say, "No, the premises are always open. Perhaps this airman didn't notice passing by." From the way they looked at me, I understood that if I wanted to cover my back, I should agree, and so I did. Then the commanding general commented that it had been a good question and ordered, in a loud voice, that a prize envelope of 5,000 lire be given to me. And so it happened. Memories of this type crowd my mind, and I would like to write about them to satiety, but perhaps the reader would not equally appreciate it, and so I return to deal more strictly with the subject matter of this book, Strictly Forbidden to Photograph. For many years, for several decades, I did not take even one photo. When I was young, between 18 and 22, I adored photography and was almost decided to practice it professionally. While in the military, I participated in a national photographic competition and won the first, second, and fifth prizes. Then I discovered astrology, and my thirst for knowledge forced me to drink solely from that source for even over 12 hours a day. From evening to morning, I decided not to take any more photos, not to practice yoga anymore, not to study chess theory anymore, not to try the ham radio exam again. I had not passed the telegraphy test because, not having an ear, I do not distinguish the dot from the dash, and to dedicate myself solely to the study of astrology. It was 1970, and I resumed taking the first photos only 38 years later, in 2008, when my love story with Daniela began. As was written in my stars, there had been a bad interruption, but also a resumption as an old man. Photography exploded again inside my soul, and on some days when I dedicate myself to this practice for a few hours, I take home even over 10,000 shots. When I resumed photographing in 2008, I also tried to compare notes with other amateurs in my city, especially for, I hoped, exchanges of information on permits to be requested, on the latest technologies in the field, and to understand something more about the prohibitions. I was very surprised by the answers I received. Among photography enthusiasts, I also interacted with lawyers, magistrates, journalists, and even newspaper directors. What most disconcerted me, and still disconcerts me today, is above all the subject of children. Usually it cannot even be mentioned. The answers to my questions deserve a separate book. Children are never photographed, period. Why? Do you realize that their photos could end up in the hands of pedophiles? So Amazon shouldn't sell kitchen knives because they could be used to commit femicides. And why are children used in the advertisements of charitable associations not only photographed, but they are given insistent close-ups that last many seconds in the advertisements that ask us to send money? But there is parental consent there, despite the fact that the photos could be used by pedophiles. And why, if a child is kidnapped, do many newspapers publish his photo with a black strip over his eyes, and then, if he is found dead, immediately republish the same photo without the strip? No one has ever been able to give me an answer to this question. Why, if TV broadcasts scenes in which the Pope is applauded by the crowd and caresses children, is no strip applied to the faces of minors? No one has ever been able to answer this question either. Why do some newspapers publish photos of children and others do not? Here, someone among the subjects apparently most educated on the matter answered or answers, due to what is stated in the privacy law. Here's the point. So I wanted to know more, and I read a very modern and very well-written manual of private law, from which I will extrapolate later the entire text of Law 63341, and of which I will also report the intervention of Professor Giovanni Iorio, author of this book, as well as an authoritative professor of private law at the Milano Bicocca University. I studied the law and realized that many, even super insiders, either never read it or did not understand it. For example, one of the major observations I collected was children cannot be photographed because you cannot ask them how to give them later the copyright for the images taken. But what are we talking about? Let's say I find myself on the street celebrating April 25th, along with many others, and let's say I take many photos of the square full of people. Then I publish some shots on Facebook. To which parents should I pay the copyrights? But copyright for what? Does anyone think that I could even get a single euro from one of those photos without then sharing that profit with the parents of all the children present in the snapshot? It goes without saying that if I were an advertising photographer and after capturing the wonderful close-up of a child, I used it on billboards throughout Italy to commercially push Nutella, I would be committing a crime there. But this crime would be the same if I photographed an elderly peasant woman or a young black man. Children would have nothing to do with the subject in question. In essence, the three main answers when I asked journalists and also jurists or law enforcement why children cannot be photographed were because the photos could be used by pedophiles, because the profits, which ones are deriving from these photos, are not then shared with the directly interested parties. No answer. As you can see, the confusion on the matter is almost total. In summary, Law 631 establishes that if you photograph in a public square and there are hundreds of people, you do not have to ask them for permission to publish. It also establishes that photographing is one thing and publishing is another. It also reiterates that portraits, for example close-ups obtained with a telephoto lens, cannot be immortalized unless the photographer is working on his own artistic journalistic research, in which in this context his action is justifiable. Yet personally, despite having demonstrated in real time that I have published over 25 photojournalism books, I quote from memory, and believing that I certainly fall within the specific paragraph of the aforementioned law, my research being absolutely oriented to try to capture that moment in which the subject notices what I am doing and try to immortalize their reaction of surprise, disdain, anger, sympathy, self-satisfaction, I have sometimes been almost assaulted by police officers or various types of security guards. Another thing that perhaps should be taught to our good police officers and carabinieri is that without the permission of a judge, no one can ask a photographer to show the content of their memory card. First of all, because I remember again, photographing is one thing and publishing is another, and until proven otherwise in our country, we do not yet prosecute intentions. Again. But I'm about to stop. I believe there's a lot of confusion precisely about the term privacy. If I go to photograph the license plates of cars under a pay-by-the-hour hotel, that is certainly an absolute violation of privacy. But what does this have to do with photographing a child playing ball in the street? In short, it seems to me that as far as photography is concerned, at least in our country, we should accept the fact that the subject is surrounded by deep ignorance, and that often, for the same, that ancient proverb is applied, perhaps inherited from the Ventennio fascist era, which went more or less like this. When you return home, hit your wife. You don't know why, but she does. Note, I asked very courteously 4 different magistrates to comment on these few lines, but none accepted. Naples, 2019. End of the preface, and returning to today's post. So, the wind, the planetary one, seems to have changed, and today it is possible to photograph child prodigies without applying virtue-saving strips or equally salvific veils in a religious sense to their faces. I hope that in the future there will be no new cases of children disappearing. Watch the noun I used, otherwise this writing would not pass, because if unfortunately this were to happen again, we could once again witness the absolute demonstration of the fact that galloping and planetary mental dementia is truly absolute. And since I love photography very much, along with cinema of all kinds, I like to conclude these brief reflections with a historical archive photo in which a popular figure at his baptism as a new voice was able to earn a cover photo without virtue-saving strips. But those were the times of the civil war in Afghanistan.